Okay, just relax into the four-opter for a second and we'll see what works best. Tell me which one is better, 1 or 2? How about now, 2 or 3? 3 or 4? Bringing the daily events into better focus, this is the Daniel Natal Show. We take it for granted that secret voting is a staple of our governmental system, but the concept was not backed by the Founding Fathers. In fact, the secret ballot only started to be ushered in at the turn of the 20th century, with South Carolina being the last state to adopt it in 1950. If the secret ballot is good, then why did the framers of the Constitution resist it? An answer might be found in the writings of Montesquieu. He's second only to the Bible in terms of how much he was quoted by the Founding Fathers. His book, The Spirit of the Law, was extremely influential. Montesquieu writes about suffrage, that is, voting, saying, "The law which determines the manner of giving suffrage is likewise fundamental in a republic. It is a question of some importance whether the suffrages ought to be public or secret." Cicero observes that the laws which rendered them secret toward the close of the republic were the cause of its decline. Montesquieu adds, "The people's suffrages ought doubtless to be public, and this should be considered as a fundamental law of democracy." John Stuart Mill agrees with Montesquieu that public voting is critical, with secret voting opening the ways to lots of bad things, one of which is its opening the way to selfishness among the voters, who would express more civic-minded sentiments and less sociopathy if others could see their votes openly. He writes, "A man's own peculiar share of the public interest, even though he may have no private interest drawing him in the opposite direction, is not as a general rule found sufficient to make him do his duty to the public without other external inducements. Neither can it be admitted that even if all had votes, they would give their votes as honestly in secret as in public." Mill, who was in Parliament in England, wrote a book entitled Considerations on Representative Government. In it, he offered some possible reforms to the system. He said that universal voting opened up the door to all sorts of dangers, such as qualified and intelligent people being outvoted by the illiterate and politically feeble-minded. For instance, Mill suggested giving educated people 2 votes, regular people such as tradesmen 1 vote, and giving no votes to anyone who was illiterate or who had accepted welfare within the last 5 years. Mill worried that the welfare class would just use their vote to do unethical things, like transfer the wealth of others to themselves. Alexander Fraser Tytler makes this same point when he famously wrote, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until that time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by a dictatorship." Aristotle makes the same point in his book Politics, that when a republic, where not everyone gets a vote, decays into a democracy, where everyone gets to vote, the ignorant will outnumber those with self-control and long-term thinking, and demagogues will arise, bribing their way into power by promising the people free food, free housing, free healthcare, spending drunkenly with abandon. Since the post-World War II period, banks too decided to encourage these excesses. Prior to World War II, banks made the lion's share of their profits by loaning to governments as they went to war, often financing both sides in a conflict. It was a highly lucrative endeavor to loan out money at interest to countries that were bankrupting themselves to wage war. As military historian Martin Van Creveld points out in his book, Transformations of War, this model hit a speed bump after World War II because the introduction of the atomic bomb made large-scale war undesirable. So what are banks to do? Without war, how would they encourage nations to get into debt that they could profit off of? Answer: socialism. By banks encouraging politicians to offer ever more costly social welfare schemes and entitlement programs that the government had no money to finance, the banks can loan them the money, at interest of course, and the corrupt politicians can use these goodies to bribe their way into power. It's a win-win all around, until so much spending crashes the currency and the whole system falls apart, after which the people will clamor for a dictator to pick up the pieces. It's a process that's so old it's described in great detail by Plato and Aristotle, and it was this death spiral that John Stuart Mill hoped to head off at the pass by discouraging secret voting. In Chapter 10 of Considerations on Representative Government, Mill even warns about mail-in voting. He writes, "The proposal which has been thrown out of allowing the voting papers to be filled up at the voter's own residence and sent by the post, I should regard as fatal." This was borne out in the election of 1864, just 3 years after Mill's book came out, when they tried to use mail-in ballots to steal the election from Lincoln. See the article from the Washington Post. Mail-in ballots were part of a plot to deny Lincoln re-election in 1864. Even as recently as 2017, Democratic pollster Mark Penn, a man to the left who ran Hillary Clinton's 2008 campaign, warned against mail-in voting, saying in his book Microchine Squared, "Vote by mail has dangers because organizers and spouses can demand to see the ballots of their family members. Organizers can stand over the shoulders of seniors in nursing homes." Penn warned about intimidation tactics by vote harvesters. But just to return to the previously mentioned Washington Post article about Lincoln, that paper's motto is "Democracy dies in darkness." Since Jeff Bezos bought the paper and weaponized it against conservatives and traditional Americans, he seems to have forgotten the mandate of the newspaper he bought. Democracy dies in darkness. Yes, it does, Mr. Bezos. So why are you and other oligarchs demanding that voting take place in darkness? People fear any political leader who has his finger on the red button. What political leaders fear is people having their finger on the red button, the subscribe button. Push it and see their narratives explode. Also consider donating to help keep these videos coming. And don't forget our website and newsletter, thenewamerican.com.